Okay, everybody. So we are back again with another episode in the Hegel series, going over the phenomenology of spirit. Now we're on the next chapter of the book. We're on the self consciousness section. This is quite a lot of content. We have about 32 pages worth of notes. For perspective, the chapters themselves, or this chapter rather, was about 38 pages. So it's almost as long as the chapter itself. Took forever. Did nothing last week except analyze this thing and take notes for 5 hours straight. Anyway, we'll hop into this, and we're once again accompanied by the one and only Snout.
You're telling me it was 38 pages in the original script, and you try to condense it, and you only managed to take 6 pages off.
Yeah, yes.
Mhm.
Um, well, it's and even the thing is like some parts of the paragraphs were like a little ambiguous, and I kind of wanted to outline the logic going into what he was saying a little bit more, just in case there was any like confusion. Um, anyway, without
Congratulations if you made it this far, by the way.
Yeah, seriously, if anyone is actually still watching these videos, it's like I expected this. These videos sort of underperform in relation to, the other kind of stuff I put out, because they're long and they're really technical. So if this is your thing, or if it's not your thing and you're just tagging along, we really appreciate that, and that's not just saying that. It's actually the truth. Anyway, without further ado, we will begin. When consciousness understands law and that this law is for itself and the object as an object for consciousness surpasses its immediacy in sense certainty, consciousness begins to understand the notion. It begins to understand that this notion of the object is proper to its knowing, and from this it begins to know that its knowing is its own, which then entails a distinction of itself from itself. Now, consciousness begins to hold itself as its own object distinct from itself, even though this distinction is not truly present within the concrete reality of consciousness in the world, but it is a distinction for its knowing, and thus the being in itself of consciousness is one with being for another. And this for another is its relation to its knowing. The in itself and for another for self consciousness are the same. Its essence is to know itself, which means it has its own identity, which relates as itself for itself and becomes its own object. Even though consciousness is one, it is its essence to distinguish itself from itself, as the in itself of consciousness is to be relational for its ability to perceive. So it is said that its being for another is to be an other for itself as consciousness. That's a lot, but it's really simple actually. Um, Basically, what he's saying is that once we reach the level of self consciousness, what essentially occurs is we now understand the fact that our conception of ourselves is not the same thing as us as such, right? If I say Gabriel or you say Snout, the concept is obviously different from the concrete sort of reality. It's like the abstraction of ourself as our own object of knowing. That's essentially what he's saying. But he's also saying a little bit more here that really does need to be touched upon. Basically, since everything that exists has being for another, consciousness as well also has being for another, meaning it's inherently relational. And in the instance of self consciousness, it's relating itself to itself. It's basically consciousness saying, "I am this. I am consciousness." But in the very sentence, "I am consciousness," that is, of course, actually distinct from consciousness as such. Um, so he's just kind of putting that out there that it is a thing in itself, but its essence, the essence of that thing in itself, is to be relational, which is to exist for itself as well, right? Inherent to its relation is, oh, well, I'm going to relate myself to myself. So that's sort of the basic, uh, almost definition of self consciousness, is what we're starting with here. Um, so I'm just going to move on from there. I hope that makes sense. Uh, when self-conscious, and like just for like you could just see like this one massive chunk here was for like the next paragraph. When self-consciousness comes on the scene, it is a native knowing in the sense that it has returned from otherness, the otherness of the world of substance, which consciousness takes as the supersensible world. When self-consciousness distinguishes itself from itself, it includes with itself the world of perception and understanding of the world of essence. But it has the desire to negate this world of otherness and relate only to itself. It takes the world of essences to be vanishing. The world of essences, by the way, just means like the world of substance or the supersensible world or whatnot. Anyway, let's not get too sidetracked. Vanishing in the sense that the world of otherness can be sacrificed, not to be confused with the vanishing movement of the world of substance itself. When consciousness moves away from the otherness of the supersensible world and becomes its own object, its difference is superseded in the sense that since it is for itself as itself, its distinction is transcended, and this is shown in its tautological understanding of, quote, I am I, which takes self-consciousness to be a reposed image of consciousness for itself. Even though it came from a world of moving otherness, or sorry, even though it came from a moving world of otherness, it now returns back to tranquility when it becomes an image for itself. Since this form is a mere image of consciousness with its world of object preserved, it is not true self-consciousness since it is not taken into account the evanescent nature of consciousness. This is the first distinct moment. The first moment has the desire to move away from the supersensible world once it has retrieved consciousness back from it. It has this desire out of being compelled from the fact that it takes itself to be beyond and more necessary, so it denies the other. This is how it creates a static conception of consciousness as the thing which returns from otherness and remains consciousness as static identity. Since it takes consciousness to be this reposed identity, it sacrifices its inner dynamism, which is its essence. And we are stuck here in the first moment with the tautology. But this world is negated. So Hegel now speaks on the second distinct moment, which is self-consciousness's unity with itself. To know this unity is to know it is its own object and is itself, but also this truth is arrived at from the realization of its double object, the first being sense and perception, and the second being itself present with its perception and sense. And it is through this that it can become its object. Its object, which is known as the negative movement across the world of sense and object, it is the, quote, all that is beyond the individual essences of perception, yet it is always imminently one with them as such. Here, a more accurate evanescent consciousness is known, and now self-consciousness begins to know its second object as such. The second moment is distinguished from the first in that its dynamism is accounted for. Okay, so a couple things. Basically, in the first sort of conception of self-consciousness, it wants to sort of just take itself as like a pure form, but in doing this, it denies otherness. Now, this is like an actual problem because in order for consciousness to actually be a particular identity, it has to have otherness to be so. You're only a particular in relation to something outside of yourself, so to speak. And in denying that which is distinct from you, you end up denying your own ability to be yourself. Now, of course, at this point, consciousness doesn't know this. It's kind of naive in doing so. It then later sort of reforms its understanding in the sense that, okay, well, I'm not completely separate from otherness, but I am this sort of, I am this consciousness that is always transcending every particular otherness, but am present with every particular otherness.
So the something outside of itself would be the conception of consciousness that's distinct from actual consciousness.
Well, no. So I'm talking about, like, in this case, the something outside of consciousness. In order for consciousness is a particular thing, right? In the case of an individual, but the something outside of itself would be the world of object, substance, or whatever. But it denies this, and in denying that, it undermines its own ability to exist, and so it kind of later reforms this understanding of itself, and it says, okay, well, wait a second, and this is what Hegel calls the doubling of the object of knowing, right? Because it gets a little hazy because there's a difference between object as such and in this chapter, the object of knowing, which is basically consciousness's conception of itself.
So like the how do I put this? The consciousness is dependent on the substance that it perceives in the external world.
Yes. Yeah. Because it can't be a distinct identity if it's not distinct from other. Because to be distinct is to be distinguished from other things, right? If it wasn't the case, what would happen then is that its identity would collapse into everything else around it, and then it would also then end up losing its identity in doing so. Right? Because, like, for example, I am me because I am not you, because I'm, you know what I'm saying? Like there's a sort of like necessary fact that a part of being me is that I'm not you. If that wasn't the case, then I couldn't be me, because then our identities would sort of collapse into each other. But in doing so, the identity would be lost.
So for Hegel, the essence of consciousness lies in its perception of the outside.
Yes. Yeah. So for Hegel, you couldn't just have like a sort of pure consciousness in the sense of like without a distinction between its object. Even in the case of self-consciousness, like, right, let's say, oh, well, I could have a pure self-consciousness, but then what would happen is it would just then make itself its own object, right? In the sense that it would basically create a conception of itself. And in doing so, that conception is the object of its knowing, but what it knows is distinct from what it is. As such, I mean, even though what it knows is itself in a way, but
the conception of self is in a way also external.
Yes,
substance.
Exactly, precisely. So Hegel says, well, this is a problem if you take it as a pure thing, because it's just tautological. It doesn't actually really tell us anything, and it also ends up denying its real reality, its phenomenological reality with the world of substance, which it exists in and through. And then so the second understanding of self-consciousness, the more matured understanding, is simply the fact that it is the I or the self that is always present throughout the distinct moments of substance, substance's movement rather, and it's distinct from every moment, but it's also present with every moment, so to speak. Right? Like, for example, like, yesterday and today are distinct, but our identities remain the same in a certain respect. So that's sort of what he's getting at, and understanding that is a higher understanding for now. There's way more to go through of self-consciousness. It's a more accurate from just the static I. So there might be one thing in here. Yeah, so this is the doubling, seeing itself imminently present with perception and sense. That's kind of what I was talking about, as being always present with its plethora of experiences of the world of substance. Anyway, moving on. Self-consciousness now takes consciousness to be moving across the instances of otherness. It's kind of what I was saying before. Yet not beholden to one in contingent particular, but always beholden to one by nature or necessity. It must be added that the negation of the first moment is of a natural logical following, in the sense that when the logic is pushed further, consciousness begins to understand that in order for self-consciousness to truly be itself, it must be dynamic. But to be dynamic, it cannot be static. So it must maintain its relation to otherness distinct from consciousness, for it to be distinct as consciousness, and thus so it can be self-consciousness. So it must maintain not only the dynamic of consciousness for its object of self-consciousness to be true, but it must also preserve with it the world of otherness, which is the world it needs to be itself as consciousness, which can be elevated to self-consciousness as its own object, which is in itself consciousness. But as it is for itself, it is self-consciousness. Finally, well, let's go over that for a second before I move to this part. So basically, not only does it need to understand that it is relational, but in terms of actually making itself, once again, its object of knowledge, it also needs to account for the fact that within that object of knowledge is almost the second object of the supersensible world, which we went over in the last section. That is a necessary part of its existence. And that's kind of what he's getting at there. So also, when it raises itself into its own object, which is in itself consciousness, but as it is for itself, it is self-consciousness. So obviously, the object in itself is consciousness, but as it relates to consciousness and being for consciousness, it is what is called self-consciousness. It's pretty straightforward. Finally, desire is essential to self-consciousness since it wants to distinguish itself from otherness so it can capture itself. It constantly tries to deny the other, but in doing this, it fails to be itself, since it is required for it to be itself. The negation of otherness undermines consciousness, which undermines self-consciousness, like pulling a single card from under a stack, and the whole stack would collapse. Self-consciousness is consciousness's desire to capture itself. Self-consciousness is the shape of consciousness. It is the desire of the shape of consciousness. Ultimately, it will not get this from its negation of objects, but rather the positive recognition of other self-consciousnesses, which we shall see to come. So after that, we now are I don't know if this is going to be immediately apparent. We might actually be building into this. I'll just keep reading. When self-consciousness takes consciousness as its own object, it is being reflected into itself. Because this being is consciousness and has inherent to it movement or negativity, this object is alive and independent from self-consciousness, which is to say, consciousness in itself exists prior in concreteness before it exists as the object of self-consciousness. This is being or spirit reflected back into itself. Here, consciousness begins to take itself as, quote, life, and refers to its own life. This is its object. So a more higher understanding of self-consciousness is actually in a kind of a way mundane. When you speak of life, in your life in particular, you're postulating, or in doing so, you're presupposing self-consciousness. You're treating yourself as a self-conscious thing, or a conscious thing, rather. And in doing so, your mind is at the level of self-consciousness. Anyway, this consciousness is not merely the existence of sense and perception, but also this living consciousness, which as the object of self-consciousness has proper to it the property of the understanding, which distinguishes the undistinguished unity of the world into itself. If we recall, in sense certainty, the understanding divided the world of objects for itself into the matters or universals underlying it, but this was its own doing, and in the world of substance, the universals are mediated and conditioned. This otherness for consciousness is what leads to self-consciousness, since consciousness is only known through its self-othering from the object. Once this becomes notional self-consciousness is reached, this tendency of wanting to move away and self-other is desire for Hegel. It's what he means by desire. Anyway, Hegel later says that the notional form is divided between self-consciousness and life. The former is the unity in which the infinite differences within substance are for, and the latter is this world of object as such, distinct from subject, which is therefore not for itself. To the extent that consciousness is independent or distinct from its object, so too is the object. Self-consciousness will now understand that although related, the two do have their own natures and are independent. And this is chiefly reflected in the nature of desire to self-other. As self-consciousness begins to take its object as life, It now understands the infinite movement as a difference and unity for itself. Life is life is known as a unified movement uh, through unity and its manifoldness. So essentially, and Hegel's beginning to talk about desire here, and desire is the desire of consciousness to try to capture itself as self consciousness, or and then thus becoming self consciousness, I should say, uh, and sort of in doing this, of course, uh, it really needs to understand that the distinct world of substance is actually a true distinction, because if it's not distinct, then it can't be itself. There's he later says here, this is the notional form is divided, right, between self-consciousness and life. The former is the unity in which the infinite differences within substance are for, meaning for self-consciousness, and the latter is this world of object as such distinct from subject, which is therefore not for itself. This essentially means that the within this notional object of life, there's a distinction present between the consciousness experiencing life and the objects through which life is for consciousness. But also, in being for consciousness, those objects are also in themselves. They also, before they can be related to consciousness, they have their own existence as well as truly distinct. So that's what he means by divided. Let's see here. Self-consciousness will now understand that although related, the two do have their own natures and are independent. This is exactly so. This is sort of seen in the desire, right? Because you wouldn't desire to distinguish yourself if you didn't actually think the thing you were distinguishing yourself from was to actually different from you, so to speak. And so life is known as a unified movement through unity and its manifoldness. And so that's actually kind of a little bit of a confusing phrase there. When I say unified movement through unity, that almost sounds a little like circular or redundant. Essentially what that means is life is its own unity that exists amongst another unity, but of course they're like imminently one with each other. But there's also a difference within as well. And that
What's the other unity?
Well, the other unity would be like the unity of like the world we live within, right? That our life exists in. But like also our life is distinct in some sense from the world around it, even though it's not separate from it.
The particular life?
Yes. But of course, as a universal law, that's the case in every individual life, right? It's as much true for me as it is for you. But like if I were to vanish, right, and you were still here, that wouldn't. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is like the unity of the individual is also one with the world it is within. It's distinct and united, so to speak. Is what I'm trying to say, and ultimately what he is trying to say. And your life is one movement through that singular world, so to speak, reality, if you will. So what are we on? Just for 3, okay. The essence of life is movement or flux, or the transcendence of all distinctions. Yet this transcendence is self-contained. But honestly, looking back, I wish I would have used the word supersession, because transcendence almost makes it seem like there's like a world outside of this one or something. Obviously, Hegel doesn't believe that, but transcendence could be understood here in the same way that supersession could also be understood. Anyway, continuing. Yet this transcendence is self-contained, and therefore self-contained infinity. In order for this sundering or movement to occur, it must have a self-same object, which acts as the basis through which this movement occurs. If movement is to occur, it is to occur from point to point, so to speak, and so something stable as the basis for the unstable to be, must be. This infinity is a restless infinity distinguished from bad infinity, which is mere endless beyond, with reference to points outside itself. Whereas This always refers back to itself, which makes it truly infinite and self-contained. Infinity operates through this movement across all distinctions. Insofar as it has self-repose, it is that it is nothing other than infinity. To supersede the moments, they must be moments, and in this sense, must be stable to be superseded. This truth is mediated or logically expressed as life in simple time and space in which its differences and stability are present to be superseded by the true essence underlying all of it. This movement is for itself all contradictions. Uh, this movement is for itself, and all contradictions only refer back to this self contained infinity. The differences between the members of this movement are ultimately contained in nothing other than this absolute infinity, which has these for itself to be its essence, as such, infinity. And it must have these for itself to be so, because if it did not, and it were not self contained within infinity, then infinity would open up, since these differences would be pointing elsewhere, but they cannot, since they all share unity with the movement. Hegel distinguishes between fluent substance, which is this essence of movement, its distinctness, which is the medium through which the fluid substance does its work as flux, and the concrete reality of the two, which manifests as a unity of the differences which are one in that they are all to be superseded and that they all share distinction. I think that's pretty clear, but this last part, for anyone actually reading the text, it does get confusing. But essentially, he's kind of pointing to what I'm pointing to, where he distinguishes between movement and then also and the fluid substances, meaning the things which are superseded, the sort of the points, essentially. So, in order to actually have movement, you need to have distinction. But in order to have distinction, you need to have self-same things which are distinguished from one another, right? To say I moved from point A to point B means that point A and point B must be what they are to be moved between. If that wasn't the case, then no movement can occur. That's essentially what he's also implying or saying there at the end. But in reality is that the movement between those points and those points are imminently one with each other. And one thing before we move on here, anyone keeping up with this, you may sort of notice a theme with Hegel. And if you're picking up on this, that means you're actually doing a good job. So he will often say, like, there's a distinction between like the abstract forms of these things, right? Like the points and then the movement as such. But in concrete existence or concrete phenomena, the two are united as one. And they're almost indistinguished in a sense in our experience. But through our sort of abstraction of them, once we do that, we can distinguish between the two things within existence. And ultimately, they have being for each other. And that sort of goes back to the first chapter of the book. Anyway, the shapes or distinct objects are for themselves, in that they are independent or distinct. But in being distinct, in particular, they are contrasted and are thus for another and require the other. And within themselves, they are divided. This is just another aspect of the infinite dividing itself infinitely into many distinct members, which are also subject to this division of infinity for itself. So basically, the distinct things are truly distinct, but they're also relational, right? And in being distinct, they're inherently relational. They inherently point to something outside of themselves in order to be what they are. But ultimately, what this is infinity or spirit. But we're going to stick with infinity because that's the word used here. It's basically just its self-differentiation for its own self, basically. Where did I actually leave off? Oh, yeah. Okay, here we are. A single thing cannot be single without distinction and therefore without division. Once divided, and since it is the case that all determinate unities have this division, then this means any one unity implies another within itself ad infinitum. In other words, one must have distinction or otherness to be one, but in this distinction, oneness is found again, and then distinction again, since oneness needs distinction, but distinct things are unities which imply oneness, and so on to infinity. This is true externally and internally, as we saw in perception, but external and internal are relative, and both have the property of unity and manifoldness, and thus, within the unity, there are many, and those are many with their unities, which also have their many, and so on. All of this is self-contained. Of course, all of this is unified in the living subject, and this process is the essence of life. The division back to unity, and so on back to division, etc., which is self-contained, is self-relating infinity. And of course, and the relation, like, how does that relate to life, which is what we take to be sort of the concrete reality of consciousness, but also the notion of life itself as self-consciousness. Well, of course, self-consciousness is experiencing that infinite movement and sort of infinite division in all areas of life. And like, for example, the reason numbers are infinite is because you can infinitely divide things, because wherever there is a unity, there is another unity and another unity and another unity. Now, one day, I probably shouldn't even bring this up, frankly, but one day when we get into British idealism, we'll see why that's actually a problem. But that's just my mind working overtime and going into another topic. Anyway, Hegel breaks down the distinctions, and in this paragraph, he will show how they are in concrete reality. 1, the shapes present within life at first want to resist being dissolved and transcended, superseded again. They deny their diremption, meaning their division, and try to remain static and have being in themselves. However, when confronted with the universal substance, they fall asunder and are dissolved. This is the second moment where they confront difference and thus are subject to that fluidity. The recognition of the movements of these shapes becomes life known as a process. Life's essence here is known as such. This does, however, become inverted in the sense that in the shape's particularity, and thus self-othering from the universal, it contains within itself the movement outside of itself. Particular implies universal, and the limit has its essence as limited in the other, which limits itself. Anyway, so we see that in this truth of self-othering, we are thus logically pushed to transcend the particular shape, since inherent to this shape is its limit. In doing this, as we shatter the shape, we create a new unity of shape, and so on, all within the self-contained infinity or fluidity. The passive existence of shape implies the movement, since in its limit it implies the other in which its identity is contained, and this other is the new shape outside itself, and the process is itself that infinite movement between the shapes. These three distinctions between the passive shape, its implication toward otherness, and movement toward it, along with flux as such, is only divided by us as an abstraction, but it is in concrete reality collapsed into one another, and thus present as a unity of life's process. Life is actual through its process and movement between shape, and thus it is required, and all the distinctions imply one another and are, in their entirety, the whole of life, moving itself, making itself actual, and one with itself through its self-externalizing shapes, which it has for itself to transcend. Yeah, basically those shapes are, you could also just understand them as the various distinctions of life, and ultimately relating back to its unity. Life as a simple unity through which consciousness moves through shapes is not atomized. Rather, it points towards something outside itself, namely consciousness, as that which is behind or that which is self-same across the various shapes of life. Now, this is kind of what we were speaking about at the beginning of this, that sort of sense of self or I, that's at first completely taken as a static thing, almost as a universal. But that is like the I itself has life, right? Life is a property of the self, which is always present throughout its life, because that's what its concrete expression is, and it's always underlying that process. Continuing here, the new and enriched form of consciousness takes its notional form for consciousness as the simple essence of the I, through which a multitude of unfoldings shall occur. The I as notion is the object for self-consciousness. This I, which is the object of self-consciousness, takes itself to be the universal, as it is that which exists beyond all otherness and shapes. Every experience that occurs for this I is transcended by the same I, and thus it is always there beyond any particular experience. Self-consciousness takes the truth of this certainty of the simple universal essence of the I as self-certain, and thus it denies the otherness which it is transcending by virtue of the fact that the I is always there and its object and experience are for it, and so it seems to them as inferior to it by virtue of its relation in being beyond any particular one. This is the desire of self-consciousness, the desire to not only distinguish itself from otherness through its denial, but also to capture itself as a pure beyond from that otherness. Yeah, so in some sense, this self-consciousness, it's kind of saying to itself, it's almost a little narcissistic, you could argue, saying, I'm here amongst everything, but not everything that I was there amongst is still with me now, even though I'm always with something. So I take myself to sort of be more important, more necessary, so to speak, and the other kind of just this, lesser thing in relation to me is essentially what it is what it thinks of itself, you could say.
And the other can be anything.
Well, yeah, the other can be anything, right? It could be, I mean, as long as it's not like, inherently self-contradictory.
Well, if the other is non-specific, but the self is something specific, then how is it not more important?
well, the other is specific in that it is other. And also the self is, you know, it's always imminently tied to another that is specific, right? So like in actual concrete reality, you're never just like relating to a vague otherness. You're always relating to whether it be a room or whatever. Let's say you're standing in a field. Okay, well now you're related to the otherness of the field, the sky, the trees, whatever. So, but even if you were to say otherness as such, well, otherness as such is a qualified, specific thing in a way. Um, so yeah, even that would run into problems. I would argue. Okay, so here we're going to get more technical now. Um, Wait, did I skip a page? Or was that?
What page are we on?
Oh, we're on 5, so we're about halfway through. Actually, this is, and to be honest, I almost feel like this part of the book is a little bit easier than the entire sense certainty part, because we sort of laid out this groundwork for how universals relate to particulars and all this, and what flux is. This is a little more easygoing if you're getting into idealism, except at a certain point, it's going to get really, really, really hard towards the end. And it was like a nightmare trying to decipher it. I eventually got it though, and I got it down pretty like specific. Of course, I also referenced other people who, read this section as well, just to make sure that I was on track and not.
What was the part that you found the hardest?
Well, in this section, you mean?
Well, I mean, just you were talking about how something was very difficult for you.
Well, in this section, there's a very, very hard, it really towards the end of it, it becomes extremely complex because we're going to start talking about the necessity of another self-consciousness. But the way in which that was outlined was a little bit difficult. Also, there was another part, I was just reading it like a day before. I mean, I don't want to, well, I guess it's okay, it doesn't really matter. But where it was kind of talking about, he was alluding to reason, which is the next section after this. But before doing that, he was talking about the mediating consciousness sort of sacrificing itself for the universal form of consciousness, and through its sacrifice, it becomes sort of vain, even though it's trying not to be, and it's extremely like paradoxical or whatever. But once you get it, it makes sense, and we'll see that much later. Anyway, self-certainty or certainty of the I comes from self-consciousness as transcending the other, and desire has its essence not in self-consciousness itself, but this negative distinctness relation between self-consciousness and its other. Self-certainty is only known through self-consciousness's transcendence of the other, and because of this relation between the two, it is necessary for self-consciousness that it has its other to be itself, as that which supersedes the other. The essence, in other words, is self-consciousness. And it is to be that which supersedes the other, and therefore its essence is in some sense contingent upon this other in order for this supersession to occur. I must have realized supersession was a better word somewhere right here. Anyway, I mean, he uses this word, so that's probably why I started using it. But because this otherness is necessary for self-consciousness and thus for its desire, it cannot ever move beyond the object of otherness as such.
Can we go back a little bit?
Yeah.
So you said something about how self-consciousness requires it to supersede the other.
Yeah.
But that at the same time, it's also dependent on the other for
Yeah.
the
So,
supersession. So how does that make sense?
well, when I say supersede the other, I mean supersede like the particular instantiations of otherness, not otherness as such. So, like for example, it always needs distinction from itself in the world of substance, but also it needs to sort of be like through the process of life, it inherently moves beyond any particular instantiation of that otherness, but it's always tied to otherness as such, is what I mean. So it's always superseding, right? It's going through days, weeks, moments, places that are all distinct from each other, and that is the essence of consciousness to do that. So in that sense, it's superseding otherness, but it's not superseding otherness as it is. It still needs it. That's what that means basically. Where was I here? Let me just trace. Okay, I think because it's otherness, blah blah blah. As the otherness is what gives self-consciousness its essence as such, and thus desire too can only be desire so long as this relation is the case. Right, because if it's desire is always oriented towards something distinct. And the distinctness needs this differentiation, obviously, in relation. In order for desire to have its satisfaction, which is the realization of its own independence from the object or distinctness from it, it must negate or go beyond this object. However, this can only truly occur when the object as a distinct thing from consciousness is negated by its own self, which is to say, the object, in order to be truly shown to be transitory, must contain the negation within. It must contain this within because it must satisfy the desire of self-consciousness by showing its inner limitation in the face of it. The object is, for the other, in essence or in itself, the negative by virtue of its distinctness and its inner otherness must be shown via its negation in itself of itself. It must be shown to be inherently limited for self-consciousness to move beyond it as truly other than it. Self-consciousness will only be satisfied in its desire when it can take itself as the unlimited in face of the inherently limited. Self-consciousness achieves the satisfaction of its desire through the limitation of otherness in relation to its universality, but its desire is only truly satisfied when it is confronted with another self-consciousness. Before we jump into that, so just want to sort of talk about why he's saying something subtle here, but it's important. In order for consciousness to sort of move beyond the object, the particular object, it needs to see. This is both true in terms of thought and its experience, of course. It needs to see that it's limited by its own nature. And in seeing its own limitation, it can say that, oh, I am the infinite, which is beyond this limited thing. And, whether that be, its movement away from consciousness in time, it's the object being yesterday and itself being here, or whether that limit being like, oh, I have an object of thought, and in my object of thought, the object itself has at some point it has a shortcoming, an inner contradiction, or a inner inadequacy, which allows me to move beyond it, which is sort of just dialectical thinking, really. So that's kind of what he's talking about there. In order to take itself as the sort of universal in the face of the limited, it has to see that the limited is inherently limited in itself, and that's truly an actual limit. Because if it doesn't see that, then it can't really take it to be really the limited thing. it would sort of undermine the fact that consciousness is this universal beyond all limits. If the limits weren't actually limits in themselves. Okay, with that out of the way, he's just going to do a little bit of a summary here for us to make sure we're on track. And this is the funny thing, by the way, people understandably say, well, Hegel's just, he's going too fast. He's not helping us. He's assuming, we know what the hell he's talking about, which obviously is not the case. If you're writing a book about something, you're assuming people don't know the information yet. He makes up his own terms, but he's actually very careful to try to keep the reader on track, even if he is super complex. I was speaking to a friend of mine today. I've known him for a very long time, and he's just like, well, Hegel just defines it, makes up his own words. I'm like what? And he's like, spirit. I'm like, well, it's because it's the most, it's hard when you're describing a new concept. It's making a new word for it, which is what this guy suggested, doesn't actually help because it doesn't tell us anything about the concept. What helps is actually using a word that has another meaning that sort of similarly implies something about what you're talking about, and also that other word to help sort of orient your understanding. Anyways, that's all to say. He's trying to be careful here for us at this point. So self-consciousness finds its completion in three distinct moments. Firstly, the notion of the pure I as its own object, its distinguishing of itself from itself. Secondly, this is incomplete because all this first form of the I is its desire. It is simply the reflection of consciousness back into itself and its denial of the other by insisting upon its own distinctness as subject independent from the object. This denial in service of its desire to be independent fully and distinct from its object, and its denial of the object as relating to it necessarily, is at this point what Hegel calls desire. This is still, however, a mere doubting of self-consciousness in the sense that it denies otherness and takes itself as its own pure object. It still has much more work to do. The third movement here, and by the way, you'll keep seeing this throughout the chapter. He'll keep breaking it into three different moments. You keep seeing this sort of triune, distinction, like keeping track that he's doing. And so, in a certain sense, just so everybody knows when we go through this, within the movement of self-consciousness, there's a bunch of little movements within the whole movement itself of that chapter. It's something to take into consideration. Anyway, so here, number 3, the satisfaction of this desire is seen when self-consciousness understands itself as the universal which is present with the object always, and because it is always present, it is also always beyond any particular one, making it universal. Since self-consciousness transcends any particular object, but is always moving through objects for its essence, it realizes that it is always moving among many shapes. This is the movement of life, and this desire is realized when it knows that it needs the other to contrast itself with. Consciousness, which is the universal that moves beyond its particulars. It cannot be the moving universal which encompasses all of the shapes it moves through unless it has its shapes, which is its otherness. These shapes, to be truly moved beyond, must be done through the inner limit of each shape, which has the negative within itself, just as much as it does outside itself. Its nature of distinctness is its limit, which means it is not universal and also points to something outside itself, which will be shown through its inner lack, manifested as internal negation. However, this satisfaction is fulfilled truly when the recognition of another self-consciousness occurs. Thus it is a living thing. Its essence is to move. So now we're sort of getting into a little bit more complex territory here, but we'll see. A self-consciousness only has its existence for self-consciousness, meaning it can only know itself as consciousness. And this is to say that self-consciousness is the realization of the unity of the I with itself across instances, which is what is called the we in a retrospective sense. The notion of itself as the I becomes independent. And, also let me just clarify here, because when we say, the we here, that's plural, right? Is Hegel referring to a bunch of people. Well, also, yes, in a way, it would equally apply, but also when you know, he's also just speaking of like the we in general. Like if you're making a general claim about the nature of human beings, and you say, well, we have the tendency to do this, and that we is only known as a unity of self through the, you know, in this case, the tendencies that we have proper to us, and that's always retrospective. Um, well, I guess actually it's not always retrospective, but he's speaking of it retrospectively. You could say, you know, we will go to the mall or something, which still presupposes this unity of self through the movement of life. Uh, the notion of itself as the I becomes independent, distinct from the object, which it moves through and beyond. In this moving through, it knows itself as the universal fluid substance or life, which is always there, the universal, beyond all its particulars. This is the reality of desire moving away from otherness to find itself independent. But this truth of the I becomes object for the self consciousness. In other words, it takes itself as its own object. Subject becomes object, and thus the I is raised to notional form of spirit. Here we see the first glimmer of spirit as such, distinct from the world of sense perception and the understanding. It is still undeveloped, and consciousness does not yet know that spirit is the universal substance in which all the shapes exist, and the substance in which I and we are one with each other in their evanescent nature. But now the basis is present for it to move beyond animal sense and perception to the reality of spirit. So, in knowing this sort of this universal of the self that exists through life and as life, uh, and having that as its own notional object and its relation to otherness, this is the first sort of birth of like a glimmer of the understanding of spirit in, you know, the
But this
idealist.
isn't. This is only the external conception, right? It's not the thing in itself.
Uh, what is, well, the notional object? Yes, is still the it's still the, yeah, it's our object of knowing, right? He's saying we're beginning to get a glimmer of a much bigger truth here about what reality is now that we understand consciousness as a real thing in the world and its otherness in
So the
relation to us.
notional form is connected to the thing in itself in some
Yes.
sense.
Yeah. Well, it can't exist as a notion unless it refers to that thing in itself. Because the like a for itself. So you have the thing in itself, which is the actual thing that has, you know, like typically people define it as something with intrinsic being, which really just means it has its real existence, its own existence. Uh,
But is a
and
notional form something with an unreal existence?
No, well, it's real in the sense that like it's for our consciousness. It's sort of it's like the inner working out of logic, so to speak, of reality. So it's ultimately it's related directly and imminently related to concrete reality, but it exists in our cognition, if you will. It's for
There's a
us.
degree of separation from concrete reality, or so
Yes,
the thing in
yes,
itself.
absolutely, absolutely. And the notion is moving. It's moving dialectical thought as such, basically. Um, and the goal of notional thinking is going to allow us to refer back to that world of substance and our relation to it more accurately. And that's distinguished from other forms of thought. You know, as we saw in the preface, the ratiocinative forms of thinking, which is merely just relating different ideas to each other. Uh,
So does the notion get progressively more refined as it's related back to the thing in itself in the loop?
Yes, you could say that. Like the notion gets more, the notion as such, like its form is always the same, but the work of the notion creates a more refined understanding through time. You can almost like, as an analogy, imagine like the notion as a giant pencil sharpener, right? And then ideas are the pencils, and the notion
Yes.
is doing the work of sharpening the idea, making it better and better and better. But ultimately, that pencil sharpener is useless as long as it has the idea. But the pencil is useless or can't exist unless it refers to the wood from which it came and the graphite or lead or whatever that goes into it. So it's almost again like this.
Wouldn't that mean the thing in itself is dependent on the notion?
Well, the thing in itself would be sort of it would be spirit, right? And spirit mediates itself for itself as thinking. It's sort of like the living reality of spirit in thought.
You didn't really answer my question though. Like, is it dependent on notion, or is it independent?
Well, no, it's independent.
Then the pencil sharpener analogy wouldn't make that much sense, because it would still be.
No. It makes perfect sense.
Well, you said it would be useless.
I said the pencil would be useless without the or couldn't exist without the materials to make the pencil, and the pencil sharpener would be useless without the pencil to sharpen. So
the thing in itself would be useless without the notion.
No, that's not what I said.
I thought the thing in itself would be the pencil sharpener.
No, the pencil sharpener is the notion. As I'm saying, the notion is equivalent to a refining process of thought.
What's the pencil then?
The idea, which is being refined, and ultimately the idea is a for itself, which refers to the in itself, and which has its own intrinsic being, related to, of course, but separate from the idea and the refining process, distinct from, I should say. So the materials that go into the pencil, which are required for the pencil to exist, are distinct from it. The pencil is distinct from the sharpener, of course, but the sharpener needs the pencil to be sharpened, right? Because why would you have a pencil sharpener if it wasn't meant to sharpen pencils? And ultimately, the pencil would kind of become useless without being refined by the pencil sharpener, which is notional thinking. It would corrode. It would become lost.
So is the notion derived from sense certainty?
I mean, it would be related to it. Yes, you can't have it without that, because without sense certainty, you don't have the object. So
then what's the idea?
Well, the idea would be the sort of abstract thought that we take from sense certainty, which be, from object to sense certainty, the object that we would find present in sense certainty.
The idea is different from the notion, right?
Yeah, the notion is like the process of working out the inner logic of the idea. So you can almost think of the notion as the movement of dialectical thinking itself. That's and every distinction goes into it, basically. Okay, did I finish this paragraph about? I don't even remember. Yeah, I did. And sorry, let me just turn my phone off. Someone's blowing it up.
Who could that be?
And Foyd, not answering. Okay. Lordship and bondage, dependence and oh God, hold on 1 second.
Was this like Nietzsche? Is this like master slave stuff? Whoa.
Yeah, well, it's actually much better than what Nietzsche ever wrote, and I'm not a big fan. I think he's sort of just. He says,
consider him a philosopher.
Yeah, that's the debate, right? It's some people say he isn't because he doesn't have a system. But like, certainly, even if he doesn't have a fleshed out system, certainly he's kind of implying a system, and everybody really does have a system if they're in a way. Even
well, his system is giving you the tools to create your own values.
Yeah, right. So it's a sort of system that lets you create other systems, maybe. So yeah, I would consider him a philosopher, but not a very good one, to say the least. A sort of second-rate philosopher.
Yeah, I think some people are like, very polemical and very critical of him, but
yeah,
there's there was some interesting stuff there. He wasn't just like a popular. He wasn't just like sort of a mere stylist.
Yes, no, he wasn't.
He was something a little bit more than that.
I think whenever people who look at my Twitter, they'll see me like shit on Nietzscheans a lot or poke fun of them. And when I'm really poking fun at Nietzscheans more than I am poking fun at Nietzsche. I think he's flawed, but I don't. I think he's like he was a serious thinker at the end of the day, and a pretty fundamental thinker. So,
but not like the most profound or
yeah, no, not really.
I think he's someone who has encapsulated the spirit of the age.
Yeah, because there's a certain element of rebellion within him that people love, I think. And he's sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Nietzsche's sort of like he's almost everything to everybody in a way, unless you're a Christian, of course. Because for the right wing types, he's like this masculine will to power figure. For the left wing types, he's this sort of like, oh well, we can tear away any traditional order down and transcend any sort of values oppressing us. So he's sort of like appropriated by every sort of temperament in a way. To be fair, I guess
his philosophy is so open-ended.
Yeah, that's a part of it. Although I could understand both perspectives, right? It's like, well, part of will to power and being extremely masculine is not being beholden to anything other than yourself, right? So it's almost like right-wing anarchism in that respect. I guess is where maybe, and people who say that don't realize that though. That's the problem.
So that means like you're not beholden to the biological sex, right? So you can become a woman.
Well, see, that's an interpretation some people would have, but then like probably the more right wing crowd would probably say, well, like of course we're like naturally limited people, but we're only going to defer to our own authority. But once you do that, you really just end up opening yourself up to something pretty well. I'm not even speaking
gay race communism.
Well, that's from the left wing perspective, but I'm talking about like the sort of like pursuit of like the will perspective that you see a lot of guys, a lot of like neo-Nietzscheans use. You just end up creating like it almost promotes like psychopathy almost. But that's just my 2 cents. I see all these Nietzschean guys out here, and I just no shade to Warrior Philosopher. He's a good friend of mine, and he's trying to build a system himself, and I respect that. So if he's watching this, he knows he's a good friend of mine, and the shade isn't directed toward him. But I'm talking about Nietzsche slop types, and I meet younger guys, a little younger than me, 19 and whatever. I was sort of similar. No, not really. I stopped being like that when I was like 16, but I'm like, yeah, like this is like not, this is sort of this is more posturing than it is thinking, and you're only doing yourself a disservice when you do that, frankly. But when it comes to Nietzsche, I can see the appeal to a certain degree, but is what it is. I'd rather them stick with that than touch this and ruin it. So I'll let them have their.
Well, we're digressing here. I'm sorry for bringing Nietzsche up.
It's okay. It's not a problem. Anyway, lordship and bondage, dependence and independence of self-consciousness. Self-consciousness exists as a unity, but it only exists as a unity insofar as it exists in a plethora of distinct moments, moving infinitely, and also that these moments are the unity of self-consciousness self-expressed. The nature of self-consciousness is paradoxical insofar that its distinct moments must be distinct from one another and from self-consciousness, which is universal beyond each one, but they must also be subsumed back into the unity of self-consciousness which they exist for. The moments and the shapes all differ from one another, but all fall back into the unity of self-consciousness and for it. They are held as distinct, but also the same insofar as they are not distinct in their nature as being for consciousness, and only distinct from one another in terms of shape or determinateness. The truth of self-consciousness is found fully in its recognition for another self-consciousness. So this is a big turn here. When self-consciousness comes into contact with another self-consciousness, two things occur. Firstly, it is forced out of itself in that it now sees another self-consciousness distinct from itself. Secondly, it does not see the self-consciousness as a free thing. Rather, it simply sees the self-consciousness as an image of its own self. When confronted, in order to be sure of its own being as essential or primary, self-consciousness supersedes the other independent self-consciousness, but in doing so, because this other is itself, it supersedes itself. Self-consciousness truly only exists when another self-consciousness recognizes it. And if there is none and it is denied, the basis for this existence is contradicted. To clarify, self-consciousness needs the recognition of another self-consciousness to exist. But the object, whilst it allows consciousness, only another self-consciousness can explicitly treat the self-consciousness as independent, and an object cannot do this because it is not able to recognize or treat self-consciousness as its own thing, moving through, being, and affirming its existence as a self. When self-consciousness supersedes the other, its only option is return back into itself. Furthermore, when it supersedes the other self-consciousness, which gave it recognition, it lets this self-consciousness depart from itself, and thus it returns back into itself. It sees itself as an image in the other and says that the other is a reflection of itself, and thus it returns back into itself in its departure from it. So here's the thing. When self-consciousness sort of comes into contact with a sort of another individual, right? Another self-consciousness. At first, it makes it insecure, for lack of a better term. It kind of mirrors that first movement we saw where it wants to deny otherness as such, and then it eventually gets over that. It kind of returns back to that immature attitude in a way, and wants to deny that other people are really their own being. Now, this isn't explicit. It doesn't really say like, oh, like nobody else exists except me.
Yeah, you're not real.
Yeah,
I'm real, but you're
right.
not.
It's more so just like what you could almost equate it to as sort of selfishness, like a psychopath, for instance, right? It's psychopathic self-consciousness in the sense that it obviously sees something else as distinct from itself, but it doesn't take into account the fact that it has its own will, its sort of own life, its own sort of relation of otherness to itself. It kind of just sees it as something within itself, basically. It's almost like saying this person doesn't consider other people, has no consideration to others. It's that kind of consciousness. It sees a distinct self-consciousness, but it really
So
says
you want to impose your will on the other person as a result, right?
Yeah, exactly, because you don't actually consider them to be as prime as yourself, so to speak, as important as yourself. It's essentially, psychopathy. When self-consciousness supersedes the other, yeah, all right. So, this is also something.
But could you also do it out of a misplaced sense of righteousness, and it would stem from the same thing?
Yes. Well, you're saying trying to help the other person, and
Well, I mean, like in the sense that like you disregard them and you think you know what's best for them.
yes. Well, that's actually a concrete example of that, I would say. Right? Because you're sort of ignoring their will. You're saying, no, what you think doesn't matter because what you think is really just inferior to my thought, and I'll brush you to the side. Whatever you think is something that I probably already know and I thought better than you. It's that kind of thing. But we're going to see how, and this is basically the sort of the understanding of the self of the Lord in the Lord and Bondsman relationship. But that's coming up. I don't want to get too ahead. Well, we're kind of in that now, but anyway. And the other thing I wanted to say is that, or what Hegel says, when it does this, it returns back to the same mistake it made before in reflecting itself back into itself, in denying otherness. It's sort of in denying the true otherness of the other self-consciousness and sort of imposing itself on it, denying itself or denying it as a real sort of thing with its own will and independence and own life and own otherness in relation to itself. It ultimately denies its real otherness, and this is self-consciousness reflecting itself back into itself in its denial of otherness at a higher level. So And in doing that, it can't. If it doesn't have otherness, it collapses. So anyway, moving on to this third paragraph, this truth.
Or if it doesn't have otherness, it collapses. What does that mean?
Well, as we've established before, right, for consciousness to exist, it has to have something distinct from itself. If it doesn't have this distinction from itself, it collapses. But this is happening again, but at a higher level, in that in denying the real independent otherness of another person, it ends up coming back, reflecting itself back into itself, and all otherness, by virtue of that, is denied essentially. And the reason that is because what you then say about the otherness that you sort of took to actually be other is that it's really not other if it can't give rise to another self-consciousness, with its own independent and distinctness and being intrinsic being in itself. It sort of collapses. That's essentially what he's getting at. So it's the same collapse we've seen before. I'm going to read this next one in case there's anything else you wanted me to clarify.
No, go ahead.
Okay. This truth is the truth of the nature of self-consciousness, and thus, when two confront each other, since they share the same qualities of being self-contained, they both act this way. Thus, the action of one is the action of both, and vice versa. Each self-consciousness does what it demands of the other. Each self-consciousness treats the other the way it treats itself, and it can only happen if both do this. Both must treat one another as something independent and also a reflection of itself, because it knows itself as self-consciousness through doing this. It must know itself only insofar as it sees that the other is like itself, but also independent, and thus can supersede, so that way it can move beyond it explicitly as the quote, the self that is not myself. Hence why both must do this in order for this to work. In order for it to recognize that it, the other self-consciousness, is a self distinct from itself, it must see the other also say the same, and that this is how it knows it has confronted something truly free. So that's where this gets a little bit more complex, right? So as we established before, if it denies the otherness of self-consciousness, it ends up denying its distinct self, right? Because then the otherness of the lower order of otherness that it took as real, it becomes kind of superficial or undermined if it can't give rise, or if true independent things, true distinct things can't exist within it. Now, since this is the nature of consciousness, as such, to sort of do this selfishness, it happens when two confront each other. They'll both do this to each other. It's almost like they're fighting, so to speak, but it's a little bit more subtle than that, right? It's a little bit more of like a mutual disrecognition. If that occurs, then no further development can occur. But when further development does occur, mutual recognition occurs. Now, what happens in mutual recognition? In mutual recognition, one self-consciousness says to the other, I recognize you as distinct from myself. And in saying that, it's implicitly saying, you are distinct because you are not me, and you are you. And inherent to you being you is that you are not me, and vice versa. And in doing this, both of these self-consciousnesses actually see the true independence of themselves in the other. And that's why it's essential and necessary. It's not only essential for their development of consciousness, it's also necessary for their existence, because they truly need to be distinct to actually exist as particular self-consciousnesses. And if they're not truly distinct, then they can't exist as particular, because to be particular,
then they would also be equals, so there would be no master and slave.
Correct. And see, you got that correct before we even got into that section. You sort of jumped the gun, but it's in a good way though. It's good that you jumped the gun, because that means you understand the logic perfectly. Okay. But he's obviously gonna gruelingly draw that out for us.
What page is this?
This is 8, so we got basically 3 more to cover.
Okay. Whoa, okay. How about 2? Because
okay,
we said we make it.
Oh, I didn't see. To be fair, I didn't know if you meant stop at 10 or read 10 and stop. So that's why I said that.
Well, let's read 10.
Okay.
Yeah.
We see in self-consciousness the same principle we saw in the play of forces. namely that self-consciousness is its own being in itself, but also to be a being in itself, it is for another. Self-consciousness is its own determinateness, but it exists for another, self-consciousness. So the in itself of self-consciousness is to be for another, self-consciousness. I'm going to stop here for a second because this is important. Any particular thing that exists is inherently relational. This is why part of being self-consciousness is to inherently relate to another self-consciousness, and to inherently relate, you must inherently be distinct. So that's just to make that more clear. When self-consciousness confronts another independent self-consciousness, this self, like any other object, has an existence for consciousness. However, this is special for self-consciousness, since it is now confronted with something that has its own will and is not a passive object. So the passive object would just be the otherness of the lower order, the otherness as such that we were speaking of. Basically, the objects around us that are not human beings or animals or whatever. Well, maybe you could even say animals do recognize us, but I won't get into that. When self-consciousness goes outside itself, it is extending itself so that it can come back into itself. Self-consciousness is aware that it is the for itself or exists for another. Self-consciousness, or exists for another self-consciousness, excuse me. But it also knows it is distinct from that other self-consciousness truly, just as it knows that the other self-consciousness is for itself and is really self-contained with its own subject, within its own subject, sorry, but also that it has determinateness as the true other. Each solicits outside itself toward the other self-consciousness, and this is done for itself. It supersedes itself as being for itself and sees that this can only be the case insofar as it is the being for another, or that it exists for another. And it is in knowing that it has existence for another that it is truly its own thing. Therefore, both need the mutual recognition of independence found in the other to know they are selves. And it is here that we can see it is in both its own independent thing, but not fully so, since in order to be independent, or better put, distinct, it must have, by its own independent nature, this movement toward the other to know its own self, and knowing its own self is the essence of self-consciousness. Both self-consciousnesses recognize now that they recognize one another. Both know that they exist for another, and that they both know this. Both require the independent recognition and recognition of that recognition explicitly to know themselves as self-consciousness. It must say, and when I say it must say, by the way, this is sort of me adding on, but I mean like it must say, in one way or another, it must communicate this. Basically, I know you as you for myself. Both must know this to know they are truly independent or distinct. So this is an extremely important crux or shift here in the phenomenology, because we're seeing that you can't just have a solipsistic consciousness. This is almost a complete refutation of solipsism.
I think, isn't this the first time he mentions intersubjectivity?
Yes, this is the very first time he does, and that's why it's sort of a crucial point. But so Hegel, people would ask, well, is Hegel a solipsist? I mean, and Hegel would say, no, I'm not, because if I was a solipsist, it would I would be denying otherness, and because the otherness would just be myself. But in doing this otherness, in denying this otherness, I would deny myself, because myself needs otherness to be. And this, and also, in true otherness is not just a sort of passive, object, right? And this is why I established before, it's actually logically necessary in multiple ways why self-consciousness needs to relate to another self-consciousness. Firstly, the essence of an object is inherently relational, as we know. But secondly, in being inherently relational, it's also inherently knowing itself. And it can only know itself through its reflection of itself in another self-consciousness. Because in doing so, it knows itself as a true independent I that is a conscious being because it's treated as such, it's recognized as such. And it knows that its object of self is not merely just an illusion, but a real thing that's reflected in other people.
So this can only happen when you encounter the other subject rather than just like an object.
Correct, absolutely. And it took me a little bit to realize this, but I finally got it. And also, in doing that, in being recognized by the other self-consciousness, you also know you are distinct, truly distinct, because in being
But
this,
why is it not possible for you to distinguish yourself based on your perception of the outside world, regardless if it's your subjectivity in that world or not outside of yourself?
because if in order to do that, you would actually have no true idea of what it means to be a subject, because you would have no reference point of subjectivity as such. You would know yourself as a sort of perceptive thing that sort of moves beyond all different instances of, you know, the object and time and space or whatever. And it's approaching that, but it's not enough. It's kind of lacking or inadequate. In order to truly know self-consciousness and individual selfness, you need to actually see another self. But it actually,
Say someone was born on a desert island and
right.
they didn't have any encounter of any people. That wouldn't be like a fully developed human being. Like there would be something fundamentally lacking in that
Yes.
person's psyche.
Yeah, definitely. You would almost start to question if you weren't real. It was funny. I was talking to my mom about this concept because she was actually very receptive. She actually understood it. I was surprised. Frankly, pretty well. But I use this sort of like scenario. I was saying, like, look, if I said, Ma, look, if you went through life and nobody recognized you, meaning like nobody like talked to you, nobody looked at you, nobody acknowledged you, but basically pretended you didn't exist, you might actually start questioning whether or not you exist. You would be like, well, okay, I mean, I can sense the world around me, but like, am I like a real person? And in a certain sense, like you need to have other people to know what a self is, so to speak, fully. And furthermore, you know, to actually be an independent self, ontologically speaking, and also just logically speaking, you must be to have selfhood. It must be distinguished from another selfhood, right? It can't just be distinguished from a rock, right? And the reason that is because a selfhood is it's kind of it has its own intrinsic being, its own existence in itself, right? It has its own sort of and in having existence in itself, it does have its own distinct unity.
But so does a rock.
Yes, but so does a rock. But you can't have that full distinct unity unless it's a full distinct unity from another, so to speak, because essentially you wouldn't be able to distinguish the rock as not just being your consciousness, right? Or a projection of it or something. And you would only know it's not a projection of it if you could say, oh, well, like my friend over here, Joe, is recognizing that rock too. And now someone may ask, well, how do I know Joe is not just a sort of representation of my own particular consciousness? Well, that would actually fall into the same problem we've been seeing over and over and over again, which is that if Joe is just a projection of your consciousness, he would not actually be other than you, and then you would collapse and you wouldn't exist. So we really do need actual otherness to know the self, so to speak, and not just real otherness of another self, because
What do you mean you would collapse and you wouldn't exist?
well, it's sort of the same thing I was telling you before, right? In that you know consciousness needs to distinguish itself as a particular from otherness in order to be a unity of self. It can't otherwise. It would be a void, and a void doesn't have actual like existence, so to speak. But it's a good question, right? So it's like why do I like you actually brought up a really good sort of like rebuttal almost. A rock has unity of self. I have unity of self, but I can't actually have the unity of self from the rock unless um, the unity of self is from uh, another actual sort of being, because what would happen then is the unity of the rock would sort of collapse into my unity, and then that would undermine my unity in the end, so to speak. Um, is kind of
It would undermine your unity, even though it's absorbed by your unity.
yeah, because then it would no longer be other. It would be one, yeah. So that's something we need to
It would no longer be other.
yeah, because like so what would happen
Was it
is
other to begin with? Was your unity other to begin with, rather than being proper to yourself?
well, no, my unity is proper to myself, of course, but the other, uh, in order to have my unity, which means I'm distinct, means I am distinct from another. But in order for me to be distinct as a self consciousness from another, I must have my distinctness from another self consciousness, because in the other self consciousness, I actually see true independence in it. Well, in itself, but for itself, meaning for me. Um,
I suppose etymologically it makes sense as well, because unity is from the same root as unit.
yeah,
It's like it's like a Latin root, like meaning
right.
something distinct or something. Yeah.
But this, like, really, the hardest sort of thing to grasp with this is why, like, logically speaking, another self consciousness needs to exist for another distinct self consciousness to exist. Because before, and like I've been saying before, you don't know a unity of, like, to say this particular self consciousness is to say another particular self consciousness in distinction from this. That's also a way to look at it too. Um, so because if there's nothing, if you just have a self consciousness and no other self consciousness, what you would really end up having is, well, you couldn't actually qualify anything about it. Then its qualification is inherently relational to another uh, set of qualities that it shares with something else, and likeness. So, and I'm glad we sort of hone that point in, because it's crucial to this text. Um, so
9.
yeah, 9. When first confronted with this truth, self consciousness will look at the other self consciousness as recognizing, uh, I think I should say itself, uh, as recognizing and itself as the, oh, sorry, no, as recognizing and itself as the recognized. It will not yet see the unity of the two as one. When self consciousness comes on the scene, it wants to deny otherness as unessential and only take itself to be essential. It wants the pure, unmediated I. Here, it wants to be essential alone or primary, and it also wants all otherness to be negated and itself pure and unconditioned. However, when it finally confronts another self consciousness, it will not yet take it as independent, yet will see itself reflected in it. However, at this point, since it doesn't treat it as truly its being in itself, for itself, it cannot truly be certain of its own self as self consciousness, since in order to do so, it needs recognition of itself truly outside itself from another in itself or independent consciousness, which must also show that it recognizes it and that it, self consciousness, recognizes the other self consciousness. It is only through this recognition in both sides that it can truly know itself as other, because it must be made explicit, but also it must come from something truly outside itself that recognizes that it is outside itself, and also that this outside itself takes itself as a true it for its own self-consciousness, or sorry, for its own self-consciousness. It must, in some sense, communicate to the other, you are distinct from me and also exist for me, and I recognize this. Until this occurs, the foundations for true self certainty are undeveloped, as a recognition has not occurred. It must see itself reflected in the other's recognition of itself, and it must see that the other recognizes this, because if it does, then it takes it to be truly distinct. Self-consciousness wants to assert itself as essential, and the extreme conclusion of this is to deny the other self-consciousness through death, even at the expense of itself. In doing this, it thinks the negation of the other independent self-consciousness with its own will and relations, ceasing to be will, demonstrate its essentiality. Self-consciousness seeks to elevate the truth of its self-certainty to a concrete reality by negating all otherness. But in doing so, since the otherness is itself, or the otherness, I should say, is proper to itself, it would be negating itself, and it can no longer know itself as truly free and independent if it destroyed that by which it knows itself as independent and recognized as such. It is not truly free if it is not amongst free agents, which freedom is contrasted with its own, and also recognizes its own. To be free is not merely to be universal supersession of all objects, but to be self-contained, and this self-containedness is only known in recognition of another self-containedness. If you are all that is, you are stuck and beholden to yourself. To be truly free is to have true existence as self-contained in relation to other selves which know you as such. True freedom is self-contained, but only insofar as it is mediated through other self-containedness for itself. That's an important qualification, because if anyone who's coming to this has read Hegel's philosophy of history, I've gone briefly through the introduction. There's a very famous quote in that introduction where Hegel says, matter has its essence outside of itself, therefore it is not truly free, whereas spirit has its essence self-contained, making it truly free. And I said here that if it has its essence self-contained, it's not truly free, and then I later say that true freedom is to have your essence self-contained, but I qualified that statement in saying that only insofar as it is mediated through other self-containednesses for itself. So basically, to have your essence self-contained, it can only be self-contained if it has its own internal sort of distinction, which basically points to its self-contained nature, so to speak. Or another way of putting it is, something is really not self-contained unless there are things that are contained outside of themselves, right? There can't be unity, so to speak, without multiplicity. And the multiplicity always points to something outside of itself, whereas unity, true, pure unity, only points to itself, but it can only truly be a unity in relation to other unities within itself, so to speak. So to say something is self-contained as such is a little bit of a contradictory thing to say, but to say, we call it self-contained in relation to things which have their essence outside of itself. But on a lower level form of consciousness, particular individual self-contained consciousnesses only can have their self-containedness in contrast to other self-containedness, which are among things that have their essence for or outside themselves. So that's the sort of qualification there. So here we go. This is a couple big chunky paragraphs here. If one self-consciousness kills the other or negates the other, so he does use the language of killing, but I think it's almost sort of like poetic more than it is literal. If one self-consciousness kills the other, it also brings the death of itself in doing so, since the recognition is now no longer possible, and self-consciousness no longer has a way by which to solicit itself so that it can truly exist as self-consciousness, as we have established self-consciousness in order to be so, must be recognized by another, and it must see that this recognition is of itself, and that the other self-consciousness recognizes this recognition. This shows that its identity is self-contained and exists as its own term in the relation for another, and as its own term within that relation is truly itself and self-contained. The killing of the other does not sustain self-consciousness. Rather, it collapses it, since its basis for existing is no longer there. If self-consciousness truly wants to sustain itself, it is necessary that the other self-consciousness must live and is not denied, so that way it can have its existence as truly its own term in a relation which is also part of its existence as being for another of its being in itself. Once death occurs, so does the desire to be other, since otherness requires an other to be other from, and this truth is mediated through another self-consciousness which has true independence. We could say the essence of self-consciousness is twofold: to be its own awareness of itself, and furthermore, to have itself in relation to another, which is aware of it as its own self. If the latter is denied, then the awareness of itself is undermined, since it has no means by which it can explicitly call itself independent, as even its own objects would be passive and not explicitly contrasting themselves with the subject, which can just take it for itself. So this is also, so Hegel's kind of, I think Hegel almost anticipated sort of the concern that you and I were speaking about, that I also had while reading this. Well, why can't I just deny another self-consciousness? Well, in doing so would end up denying itself, because it wouldn't be truly free. To be truly free is to have your own independence, but you can only really be independent and distinct insofar as you relate fully and truly to another. And that full and true relation cannot simply be to the passive object, because the passive object, as we've established, doesn't actually is not another self-consciousness, which one can recognize you, but is also one in which you can say, oh, I know myself as this thing called self, as consciousness, because there is another thing that is truly also self-consciousness, distinct from me, that has my qualities by which I can distinguish myself from. That's also a way of looking at it too. So, and it's kind of interesting. I mean, this is really like a coffin sort of, or nail in the coffin, so to speak, for any solipsistic philosophy. I don't know how this was not, maybe this was picked up by other people. I just never saw it. And this is a pretty fundamental text, right? This is a pretty popular book. Anyway, self-consciousness is now beyond the first mediated I and has become relational to another self-consciousness in its development. This is its next unfinished mediated state. This relation is necessary for it to sustain itself, and it does so by receiving recognition from it. The first self-consciousness is for itself and is self-same, and the second self-consciousness through which it relates and receives recognition is for another, namely for the self-consciousness that is for itself. Since it must relate to this other self-consciousness for its identity and take from it, we now have the birth of the relation between Lord and Bondsman. Both are juxtaposed, but in this juxtaposition, they feed into one another and are for each other, and this is not yet understood to be, at a higher level, a real unity. Since the bondsman has for his object work or labor, he is confronted with his own self in the work he produces, or in the work he produces, and the work is therefore a reflection of his being for self, which adds permanent reflection of this he can relate to in a negative manner, negative in the sense that he is distinct from the object he produces. This is contrasted with the Lord, who merely enjoys the fruits of the labor produced by the bondsman, and thus the Lord has a fleeting enjoyment of objects, but never actually comes to know himself through them. Work is the halting or fleeting desire in favor of expression of self-consciousness in what it produces, which allows for a richer sense of self-consciousness for the bondsman, since he knows himself through his work and his relation to its existence in the object. It is through the existence of the object produced by self-consciousness of the bondsman. I'm not going to read the rest of 11 except for this part. That he can contrast himself with a permanent representation of himself, and therefore know himself as an independent self, which is reflected in the permanent object of his work. The labor in itself is his own activity, which he knows himself in and through, since this activity is proper to him. It is how he exists as his own determinate being. So, of course we can know ourselves as well through the object, but in order to know ourselves in relation to the object and work, it's going to be work for another. uh, as well. But knowing yourself through your own labor is, of course, doesn't necessarily contradict the knowing yourself necessarily through another. As a matter of fact, you might say one implies the other in the sense that if you truly are independent, you should be able to know yourself through your own work, which is distinct from you, but a reflection of you. So that's also why Hegel says the bondsman actually has a richer sense of self-consciousness because he sees himself reflected directly in what he does. Whereas the Lord, who merely enjoys the fruits of his labor, doesn't actually, see a reflection of himself anywhere um, to the same extent that the bondsman does. The Lord may see himself in relation to the bondsman, of course, and see himself as distinct, but he doesn't get the full sense of independent self that the bondsman does because the Lord doesn't actually see almost a direct reflection of himself in anything, where the bondsman sees that direct reflection of himself in his work. So with that, that's 10 pages done. We got 22 more to go. So that's at least 2 more episodes for this. Is there anything else you wanted to add or say before I end this?
No, not pertaining to
Okay.
to Hegel, no.
Okay. Well, all right. Well, with that, we'll call it here.